Sorry, I learned how to do that. I have a dog. Sometimes he gets off the leash, and that's the most effective way. Didn't mean to insult him. But welcome to this wonderful early spring
Now, and I won't
day.
forget
It's
it.
almost 50 degrees today, I understand. And I guess it was 2 days ago we crossed the barrier, even before the equinox, where we actually had 12 hours of darkness, 12 hours of daylight. We've now passed it. Once we have more daylight now than ever, things are looking up. All right, now. I'm Stan Moore, Chief Expert. And a couple of things just administratively before we introduce our speaker for tonight. Dues. Unfortunately, we're like most societies, we have costs. And it's mailing and computer costs and secretarial services and so forth and so on. So we really appreciate what you do for us in the way of dues. And what we've noticed in the last couple of years is that we've gotten maybe a little bit less than tight in just accounting for who is up to date and who may not be quite up to date. And it varies, and a couple of people go back a couple of years. We've just made a command decision today. We think you're going to like it. If you are going to pay up for 2014, guess what? You paid up. No arrears. All right? No assessments, no fines, no extra money. Please, we'd like to have your support. We need your support very much. Obviously, your attendance is marvelous. We have another big crowd here today. I can't get over the sizes of the turnout for our programs. They're just marvelous, and thank you very much for doing it. But if you will pay your dues, bring them up to date. We'd really appreciate it. It's $25 for a single, only $30 for a family membership. So that's what it is. And our finances are in pretty good shape right now, and are getting back in shape thanks to the leadership of Jim Sweeney and company. We're having a membership thrust this year. We've been holding at about 150, 160 members, and we'd like to see if we can do something to improve upon that. So we would welcome anyone in the community to join us, and we would love to have you. We had a nice archives report from Kathy Derringe, who is our archivist for the society. Our archives are located officially in the basement of Village Hall because that's where we have the space. So we put a lot of money and investment of time and energy and effort there, and those archives are building. They have almost doubled in the last 2 years. And we're considering expending some of our dues money on things like software databases. We're going after grants aggressively and actively, and we're getting some new equipment to help our efforts down there. But you know, when you talk about the archives, it all comes back to collecting the information that's out there in the way of history for our town of Washington and village of Millbrook. And I want to show you an example of how some of that history comes about. And let me show you something over here. I went to a village board meeting last month. And believe it or not, it was village trustee, it was Buddy Cox. He came out and he says, Stan, he says, I was down in the old Round Table building, you know, down the lower end of Barrett Avenue, Barrett and Front Street. And he says, I was walking around there, and he says, that was an official visit, so on. He says, I noticed there's something sitting on the floor. There's an old photograph. And he said it was being walked on. I picked it up. What was it? It's a class picture of Millbrook Memorial School, 1960. It was very crudely glued onto a baseboard of some sort. I don't know what it was. Couldn't even get it off. And it was crinkled. It was deteriorating. And I think another 6 months we just would have trashed it. But we did rescue it. Got a very simple frame and a mat, which was done by one of our members. And this is now part of our archive. And it's things like that. The serendipitous finding of an artifact, a photograph. It could be a toy, it could be a barn, it could be something of an historical nature, of a document. It's so important to our archives and the preservation of our local history. So I would encourage you, as springtime approaches, and it's the traditional time for cleaning house, isn't it? Cleaning house, cleaning the garages, cleaning the closets, and so on. And you would be amazed at how many documents like this are found on front lawns of Millbrook residences for collection by the village highway department for trashing. So guess what? We've been in touch with the highway department. They've included in about it. And they are on our side. And they'll be looking for things like this nature. Also, we're very fortunate to have Joe Magnarella, who works at the recycling station for the town of Washington. He's clued into this. And his eyes out and ears out for such things as this. It's the very simple documents. They seem to be of no estimable value at a point in time. They really are so important to preserving our history. So I would encourage you, if you have any documents at home, maps, letters, books, things of that nature, please consider forwarding them and giving them to society for our archives. Okay, that takes care of that. I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Mr. Tom Lake. And I asked Tom, I said, where were you born and raised? He said, Beacon. I said, where'd you meet your wife? He says, Millbrook. I said, well, let's just cross the river. How'd you do the river? He says, well, we got across the river. We met over there, and I went over to Millbrook a lot and met her over there. I said, okay, fine, what do you do, Tom? And he says, well, I used to work for DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation. And he said, I was a naturalist and an educator for DEC. For how many years, Tom?
I still am.
Still am. I'm sorry. I missed it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
He also teaches anthropology at Dutchess Community College. So, Professor Tom Lake. Okay? He's also a practicing field archaeologist. I said, okay, Tom, what's your crowning achievement in life? You know what he said? His grandson Tom is over here. I thought that was nice. Tom's going to be spending the evening talking with us about the first people of Millbrook, and without further ado, Tom Lake.
Thank you, sir. Okay, we're going to turn some lights off anyhow. I learned we turn the wall off. I hear snoring. Is that good? Well, if you turn the middle off. That's good. Just, I think that's good.
That's good.
Well, good evening. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Does everybody see well? Okay. Yeah, when I was asked to come here and give a talk this evening, well, one of the things I've noticed recently is that historical societies have become interested in prehistory, which is that which preceded what historical societies are about. That's kind of a nice thing, because I often get the feeling that there are people who believe nothing of importance occurred until Europeans showed up. And as you'll find out, a lot went on and a lot occurred. Our heritage of the Hudson Valley is it goes into very deep time, and it's very, very important. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. I put up here the first of us in Dutchess County. I think the flyer said the first people in Millbrook. I did that mostly to Stan, so he would think I was actually going to talk about Millbrook. The fact of the matter is that we talk about a place like Dutchess County, Millbrook, New York State. Those are political boundaries that did not exist before Europeans showed up. The native people, the indigenous people, they had land, they had boundaries, they kind of knew where they were, but they weren't published, and so they were kind of like very movable, very, very flexible. So to say the first people in Millbrook is being a little presumptuous, but we're going to kind of talk about that anyway. But it's the first of us in Dutchess County. Now, in order to talk about the first of us in Dutchess County, we really have to go back much further than that. It's only fair that we set the stage for what was going on here when we first showed up, and I'm hoping this is going to work. It works. First thing I want to mention is that today starts the 21st year of a natural history journal I've been editing for 21 years called the Hudson River Almanac. A few of you are here tonight having read in the Hudson River Almanac about this talk tonight. It's a weekly email, natural history journal, of what's going on to the best of our ability in the Hudson Valley, from the high peaks of the Adirondacks to the Atlantic Ocean. It covers birds, it covers archaeology, fish, moose, as you can see, bald eagles this time of the year in their nests, a whole bunch of things. It has a tremendous range of things that are happening and going on. It's free, and it's our 21st year. I've got a clipboard up here. If you think you might want to receive it, it's free. Give me your name, your email address, and we'll send it to you. And at some point, you can't take it anymore. You send the email back and say, stop! But I've never had anybody do that. But just as a note, if you want to do that. But if you'd like it later during the break, please come up. I've only got room for 11, but you can write on the back if the front fills up, okay? All right. Again, I was talking about the political boundaries that we deal with so much today. You'd be surprised, in my job, even the state who controls a lot of the archaeology we do, they're really much into towns and counties, and I guess they have to put their arms around very large areas, and in order to do that, we kind of have to use our political boundaries. But people also often talk about, famous archaeological sites in Dutchess County. Yeah, there's a lot of them. Sylvan Lake, for example, is one of the most famous. But the people who lived at Sylvan Lake, they moved into Putnam County and over into Connecticut, and so they moved around a lot. So when you think about the prehistory, you have to think regionally. You have to think the Northeast, the Hudson Valley, because that's how the people looked at it. Okay, and there was a time before Millbrook, and that's kind of the point here today. There was a time, if I move around a little bit, oh, by the way, I forgot to change out my bed slippers this morning, so I hope that's okay. I brought shoes, but I talked to a few people, and the consensus was that if I left my bed slippers on, it would be okay. Good. There was a time before Millbrook, about 21,000 years ago, there was a tremendous ice age going on. The last of what we think were 8 ice ages that we had over the last 2 million years. Climatologists, scientists are not sure why ice ages start, and they're not sure why they stop. They think it has something to do with the way the Earth rotates on its axis, the way it revolves around the sun. Some little thing occurs to make winters longer and summers shorter, and over time, ice builds up at the poles and at higher elevations, and pretty soon you've got ice everywhere. And then at some point, 20, 30, 50,000 years later, that little change goes back, and summers get longer and winters get shorter, and it kind of reverses itself. We've had 8 of them. The most recent one was about 21,000 years ago. This was polar. This was all the way around the world. It wasn't just here. It was everywhere around the world. But about 21,000 years ago, here in the Northeast and at Millbrook, nobody was home. We had a mile and a half of ice overhead. And those of you who go ice fishing and complain about cutting through 2 foot of ice, you'll appreciate what a mile and a half of ice is like, because I do that. Tremendous glaciers, nearly 2 miles thick, traveled from the northeast to the southwest. They swept across the land. Places in Dutchess County and the Hudson Valley where you can find exposed bedrock, you'll often find the grooves right in the bedrock that were made by the glaciers as they passed across, moving very, very slowly. Glaciers carried in their belly rocks the size of school buses, and they used them as like diamond cutters. So there are places in the Hudson Valley where you can find these glacial striations, proof of what was going on here about 21,000 years ago. Ice covered the land, a lot of North America. Laurentide ice sheet right here, that's our ice sheet. We're under the ice right here someplace. But it pretty well sealed off North America, and this continued all the way around. In the southern hemisphere, it wasn't quite so much. In South America, for example, the Andes Mountains certainly had a lot of ice on them, and a lot of the land was covered, but you have a lot more land mass in the northern hemisphere. The thing about this ice age that we had is that the sea level throughout the world was lower by 250 to 400 feet. You could step off the shore here at the time, at say Breezy Point, and you could have walked several miles out to the edge of the ocean right here, where the Great Abyss is today. This was all the continental shelf, and we have very good evidence that there was life out here. There were forests, there were grasslands, there were animals living out here. There may have been people living out here a long, long time ago, but because it's now under hundreds of feet of water, it's very difficult to find evidence. There weren't a lot of people, they didn't leave a lot of stuff behind, and so it's very difficult to find a lot of evidence. What we have found is evidence of extinct elephants living here. And we've also found evidence of the forests that were growing there because scientists dig down to the bottom of the ocean, they pull out sediments, they find pollen, and when they do a pollen analysis, they find out that 21,000 years ago, pine trees were growing out here, and grasslands were growing out here. And that certainly attracted animals, like the Ice Age elephants that we had. This is what the continental shelf might have looked like, grasslands, and these Ice Age elephants, which were mastodons and mammoths. By the way, on the table over here, I've got a series of artifacts beginning with these Ice Age elephants and ending with the types of artifacts that were used by the indigenous people when the first Europeans showed. It's kind of a sweep through time, and you'll see all kinds of things over there. And these are artifacts that I've recovered, or my colleagues have recovered when I'm working with them at sites that we've worked on. Traditionally, when we do archaeology for someone developing, a lot of archaeology we do is for the development of buildings, building a new Walmart, or a Lowe's, or something like that, a house. And the people who pay for that archaeology want the work done, but at the end of the day, we say, hey, you want your artifacts? Can't use them. So we end up inheriting, and we use them as teaching tools. So that's how I end up with all these things. 21,000 years ago. But then it got warmer. That change occurred and the ice age began to recede. The glaciers, we call it wasting away. They didn't actually physically back up. They just began to melt. The best way to see that now is to go into any huge big mall parking lot. We've had a winter when the snowplows have been plowing all the snow in one place. And at one point, they were huge. You couldn't see the stores. I mean, huge. And the snow was very dirty because it collected all the stuff that was in the parking lot. Now you go there each day with a warm sun, you see this wasting away. It's receding in size. That's kind of what the glaciers ended up doing. So about 15,000 years ago, the climate had changed and the ice had gone, and the Northeast, we're right in here somewhere. Well, we're right here somewhere. The Northeast was pretty much ice-free. Now, one thing about archaeology, it's a science, but it's not math. It's not an exact science. And that's the way it's supposed to be, because if something's exact, it's kind of hard to learn new things. And one of the hallmarks of archaeology and anthropology, really, is that it is a living science that we learn new stuff every day. For example, everything I'm telling you here today is good for tonight. Tomorrow morning when we wake up, some discovery may be made someplace which makes half or all or some of what I've said tonight obsolete. So it's the knowledge that we have right now. So you'll see a lot of these things like about 15,000 years ago. Evidence might come tomorrow that it was 16 or 15 or 14 or some other time. All this glacier, there's a lot of water up in the ice. It all melted, and the Hudson Valley was filled with glacial lakes. Very, very cold, fairly deep. And a lot of that water could not get out to the sea because the leading edge of the glacier, which left us Long Island was the leading edge of the glacier. All the sediments on Long Island, that was part of the belly of the glacier when it melted. And it blocked the water from getting out to the sea. So for a while, the Hudson Valley and Millbrook was tremendous coniferous forests, pine, balsam, firs, and very cold water nearby, very, very cold water. Not the kind of environment that would attract very many animals. Woodland caribou were here, but a lot of the support systems that would have supported us just weren't here. We were in the Americas at that time, south of here, where it was warmer, to the west of here. But when they looked into the Hudson Valley, they saw a climate they just assumed not deal with. It took a while for the Hudson Valley to be something to be attractive. About 13,000 years ago, these dams broke away, and the cold glacial water was able to come out. So about 13 years ago, we became an estuary. An estuary is where you've got fresh water from the land and salt water from the sea. Now, they didn't start mixing right away because with all the weight of the glaciers on the land, it had depressed the land. And sea level was very much lower as well. So the sea just couldn't kind of make its way too much up into the Hudson. But what it did do, it did allow fish to swim up the Hudson River. So we were beginning to put together a scenario where people living elsewhere in the Americas would look at the Hudson Valley and say, wow, Millbrook's where I want to live. Right? This happens to be, it's not the greatest picture in the world, but this is supposed to be Staten Island, this is Brooklyn. This is the Verrazano Bridge. If you've ever got across the Verrazano Bridge, that was what we call the Harbor Hill Moraine. There was an earthen dam across there that was laid down by the glacier when it finally wasted away. And it took several thousand years for the pressure of these glacial lakes on it to finally make it break away. And there were some other places too where water was able to get out. Still no people. But this is the present day configuration of the Hudson River. Most, if not all, of the way the Hudson River watershed, this is the watershed, looks today, was carved out by this last glacier. Some of it may have been done by previous glaciation, but we think that most of it was from this one. Here's a little bit of Vermont, a little Massachusetts here, a little bit of Connecticut down here, New Jersey, and of course New York. And it goes all the way out into the Mohawk River Valley. So this is the Hudson River watershed here. And here's Poughkeepsie, so we're kind of over here someplace. But that's the watershed concept. Any drop of water, theoretically, that lands in the shaded area will eventually make its way to the Atlantic Ocean. That's kind of how a watershed works. In the DEC, when we consider impacts of things that are on the land, we consider the watershed. And anything that happens, up in here, theoretically, if it's a bad thing, it could affect people downstream. So this is downstream, that's upstream. So somewhere's around 13,000 years ago, life returned to the Hudson Valley and Millbrook. Life returned. And I'm not being facetious. I'm just giving you a kind of a context here. But it is true. Life returned everywhere. This is a Charles Knight print of the life that was here. And I think it's pretty fascinating. Actually, this is life that was in Ohio. And most of these animals were here. This is an extinct form of bison called Bison antiquus. This is a muskox. We think they were here. This is a giant beaver. down here. This is a woolly mammoth. This is a mastodon. And there's one more. This one, you ever know what that is up there? What kind of bird is that? Vulture. You're right. It is a vulture.
Condor.
That's a California condor. Now, you know, California condors in California, so they call them California condors. We did not know that there were condors here until about 10 years ago. We excavated a mastodon at Hyde Park. And it took us over a year to find that animal and get it. And in the year that we had to do that, we spent a lot of time doing other things and collecting bones we found. And we found some anomalous bird bones that were at a level that dated back, I'm guessing, 10,000, 11,000 years ago. And we went up to Albany, looked at their comparative bone collection for birds. We said, wow, man, California condors were in Hyde Park, which means they were here too. They're not here now, but they were here at one time. This is kind of a nice thing. Later on, they found other remains of condors out near Lake Ontario. So apparently, the California condor was not uncommon throughout North America at one time. This is a great, I mean, look at that old day. That's great. The one that's a little problematic here is the saber-toothed cat right here, Smilodon. They were in New Jersey, but we don't really have any evidence of them being in here in the Hudson Valley, but the evidence could be lost. We have so developed the Hudson Valley that, believe me, things can be lost. Some wonderful things we may never know. Families of mastodons, so 10 feet high and weighing 10,000 pounds, wander Dutchess County. We got that figure 10 feet high and 10,000 pounds by the one that we excavated at Hyde Park. That was a 34-year-old male mastodon. And those who know how to do these things, a guy named Dan Fisher of the University of Michigan, he was able to take the reconstructed skeleton and somehow through a computer program put flesh back on it. And he estimated that this animal was 10 feet high at the shoulder and weighed 10,000 pounds and was probably typical of mastodons living in the Hudson Valley. Big animals, extinct elephants. Hudson Valley about 13,000 years ago. Besides the word about, you'll see this about symbol a lot, because we're careful. There's not very many things in the field of anthropology or archaeology that is absolute. There just isn't. The question I get before we move on to the first people is, and people ask this, you know, where did all the animals go? Where did all these elephants go? Why don't we have elephants here anymore? We had climate change. Not dissimilar to what's going on right now. It's going so slow, and it's kind of difficult for everybody to see it on an ongoing basis, but it's happening. Climate change happened back then as well. The Ice Age elephants we had here were fine-tuned for an Ice Age. They had small ears. Those are small ears. They had stocky bodies, and had a lot of body hair. Woolly mammoth, for example. We think mastodons had a good amount of fur on them as well. That was not the prescription for living comfortably at a time 10, 11,000 years ago when the climate was similar to today, even warmer perhaps. It might even have been warmer at that time. So they did not do too well, and eventually they didn't just keel over and die, but because they were so uncomfortable, they stopped having quite as many offspring. You can understand that, right? And so so after time, critical mass dropped below critical mass, and they did not have enough they didn't have enough offspring to replace parents, and so they eventually went extinct. Around the world, by the way, different times. Here, about 10,000 years ago, 10,500. Look at a modern elephant today. Okay? Look at the ears on this guy, right? You know, and very little body hair, and sleeker bodies too. See, elephants, modern elephants, and we think Ice Age elephants, they have 150 gallons of blood. You might wonder about the ears. The way they stay cool is to take all that blood and run it through the capillaries in their ears. And the heat can get out. Now, if you've got small ears, you're not able to get rid of much heat. These guys who live in Africa and the Indian subcontinent, they have a radiator, 2 of them, and they can get rid of a lot of their body heat. So through evolution, elephants have learned to find, if they're living in temperate, tropical places even, they have big ears and that helps them survive. Ice Age elephants didn't have that. Actually, during the Ice Age, it would have been a disadvantage to have big ears. They've been losing too much body hair. So climate change, the reasons why we don't have it. Fragmented ecosystems, disease. When we excavated the mastodon Hyde Park, we thought it'd be a good idea to go look in the State Museum of New York and find out how many other skeletons they had there. And they had quite a few of them. And when we did that, almost every single one of them, including the one at Hyde Park, when it died, didn't die of this, but when it died, had tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is endemic. It's in here all the time. It's out there. Every day you run into it. But we have developed an immunity to it. It's only when our immune systems become compromised, like AIDS, when our immune systems become compromised, we can track these diseases. A person who dies of AIDS doesn't die of AIDS, they die of pneumonia, they die of something else because their immune system has been compromised and they're susceptible to diseases. That's what we think happened to a lot of these elephants. They ended up dying of a lot of different things because their immune systems were compromised. Now, interesting, how many people here have dogs? Come on, you can raise your hand. You can. Good, I have a dog. We had dogs here too, probably in Millbrook. At the late Pleistocene, there were two kinds of dogs we had. There was the plundering, these are names scientists have given. There was the plundering dog and the bone-eating dog. Now, since we have no living examples of them today, we had to ask for volunteers. So we had a hyena that said, yeah, sure, I'll be the plundering dog. And our golden retriever said, okay, I'll be the bone-eating dog. Mostly because he loves his bones. Right? But we did have two kinds of dogs around here. Those are the scientific names that lived around this area. These may have been the forerunners of animals like wolves. Right? Or they may have been a wolf-like animal themselves. But the skeletons have been found right here. We entered the Americas, big controversy in the field of anthropology about when the first people came to the Americas. The fact that they came is important. Some people, they want to know exactly when, and we may never know. The evidence which will tell us when the first of us came into North America may be buried someplace under 200 feet of water out in the Pacific somewhere. But we think, the best knowledge we have is that they came from Siberia. Remember the oceans of the world were 250 to 400 feet lower, which means they could have walked across dry land from Asia to North America. They also had at that time the ability to come by boat. A lot of people look at this and say, well, they only could have come when the sea level was lower. When the sea level was up, they couldn't, because they couldn't get here. Humans like ourselves went to Australia 40,000 years ago by boat. Even when the sea level was lower in Southeast Asia, you could not see Australia. And so they got in boats and they went there, enough of them to establish a population. So they were seafarers as well, to a certain extent. So they might well have come out of Siberia, and we think they're Siberia. DNA tells us they're from Siberia, and they might have worked themselves down the coast and finally worked their way to South America. Beringia is that land bridge, and that was available to people to walk across between 36,000 years ago and 16. There are two ways that scientists are looking at this. You know what DNA is. Scientists take DNA samples from all Native American, all indigenous peoples in all the Americas. And when they analyze the DNA, they look for changes that have occurred over time. And they can actually count them up and go backwards. It's a clock. They can go backwards in time and decide, well, the biological clock for DNA for our Native Americans began, they think 16,000 years ago. I think it's a little conservative. The other one, which is wild, is this one called glottochronology. Glottochronology means study of language. Scientists have gone, and this must have been some undertaking, they've gone throughout the Americas, and they have collected samples of every known language. There's a few that have been extinct, but they've gathered all the language they can find. And they've looked at what's called a lexicon. A lexicon is 100 words that seem to be common to all different language groups. And when they looked at all those, they looked at the differences in those 100-word groups. And they estimated how long it would take for one or two language groups coming from Asia to spread and develop and change to get to where we have hundreds and hundreds of them today. And they thought it would take 36,000 years to do that. So these are just some scientific tricks. They're not exact. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, somewhere around 25,000 years ago. People came here. First people here in the Hudson Valley, somewhere around 13,500 years ago. You'll notice I use this calendar years ago. We have something called radiocarbon dating that we use, which is a wonderful tool. In the wake of World War II, a lot of advances in science came forward, and one of them was this radiocarbon dating. It gave us really nice datings on things. The problem was, until about 15 years ago, we thought it was the cat's meow. Then we discovered that we had miscalculated back in 1950. Willard Libby, University of Chicago, when he developed this, he underestimated the amount of carbon that was in the atmosphere in the way far past. So that when we do radiocarbon dating right now, we've got to add about, it depends on when, but for this area of the Hudson Valley, we've got to add maybe 1,000 years. So if something radiocarbon dates to say 10,000 years ago, it's really 11,000 years ago. And that's important. I grew up watching Peabody and Sherman. You guys see that? And the Wayback Machine?
Yeah.
Now, if you got the Wayback Machine, you want to go back to a certain time. You better not go back to the radiocarbon date. You better go back to the real calendar date, or else you're going to miss it. So that's kind of important. Here, this is the diorama from the State Museum. Here's a woodland caribou. Here's what we call a Paleo-Indian. He's pointing out a flock of geese that are flying. They're actually, this is fall time, so they're actually flying north. But these are the first people that came here about 13,500 years ago. The fluted point, this point is over there, by the way. This point is about 12,500 years old. It's emblematic of these very first people that were here. There's also the possibility there were people here earlier than that, but they haven't left any evidence of it that we can recognize. Which means we may not be smart enough, because when I do excavations and I pull stone tools out, this is Stone Age, by the way, all stone tools. When I pull a stone tool out of the ground, I look at it and I say, I don't know what this is. It could be that that's emblematic of people who were here 15,000 years ago. So we have some smartening up to do. Our archaeology is evolving as to what we know. No bows and arrows, by the way. Bow and arrow came way, way late. So that projectile point I showed you went on the end of a dart or the end of a spear. And they had a spear thrower called the atlatl. That was the technology of the time. The atlatl was an advancement over a spear itself, because if you're hunting something that's 10,000 pounds and is 10 feet high, you don't want to have to run up and jab it with a spear. You want to be able to throw a spear at it at a pretty good distance. The interesting thing, and this is where anthropology kind of works its way in, archaeology tends to be very one-dimensional. It's black and white. Here's your artifact, here's what we think it is. It doesn't tell you a whole lot about the people. And I've always felt that it's important that we do what we can to learn something about the people, anything at all. And I'll get into that in just a minute. But one thing about, we do not know who these people are. We don't know their tribal names, we don't know their personal names. We don't know much at all except the artifacts that we find. And we try to read into them as much as we can. People often get very angst about this. They think they know their names. I hear people tell me about the Wappinger Indians all the time, and the Mohican people and all. A lot of the names we hear are names that were given by Europeans. The Indians may have had a name similar to that, but anyway, we don't know a lot about what the people were all about. We know them by the artifacts they left behind: pottery, form of stone, and here, in the case here, a spear point. It's rock. And in some cases, if it's not too old, we do find artifacts that are organic. We will find things made out of wood, bones, cloth, things like that. But if you go too far back, more than about 1,000 years, that stuff has biodegraded in the soil. It does not last. We go to the American Southwest, and these Dutch students to the American Southwest, and there, archaeologists, I've done archaeology there, we find things a few inches under the surface that are 10,000 years old. They're sandals somebody wore. Because it's so dry in the American Southwest, nothing goes bad. Nothing ever ages, nothing ever biodegrades. Big, big advantage to doing archaeology in the American Southwest. Okay. Why did the first people come here? To Dutchess County, the Hudson Valley. And we think it was predictable resources. Before, when I was talking to you about these big glacial lakes, big coniferous forests, woodland caribou were here, but you can't eat caribou 7 days a week. You just can't do it. There had to be other things. Once the river became an estuary, now you had options, now you had resources. More than just that, you had annual runs of fish. Birds, snow geese, and others flying up the river in the spring, flying down the river in the fall. So you can kind of time out your year depending on resources that were available. Now all of a sudden, it was looking better. In addition to that, we began to get deciduous trees like oaks and maples and hickories. And with those came chipmunks and squirrels and white-tailed deer. So this place became, 11,000, 12,000 years ago, the Hudson Valley became a very attractive place for people to come and finally live. Fishing was a big thing. Fishing was a huge thing. And along the mouths of tributaries. If you go over to the Hudson River and look at Fishkill Creek, Wappingers Creek, Fallkill Creek in Poughkeepsie, any of those tributaries, we have found evidence over and over again that those are places the indigenous and native people would go every springtime to fish. And they would meet other groups of people. These were hunters and gatherers. They'd meet other groups of people. And it was a very important time of the year because they'd be meeting people that they might not meet again until next spring. So they found mates that way. They exchanged stories, all kinds of things. They exchanged goods, they traded things while they were catching fish. So they were called fusion points, groups of people coming together. Marriage was a big thing because the clans of the native people that lived here in Dutchess County, most Native American clans throughout the Americas, you could not marry anybody in your clan. It was called incest. Even though they were not blood related, it was called incest. You were forced to marry somebody in another clan. Well, what if you never saw any other clans? Well, this was an opportunity for you to find somebody in another clan who you liked. And the idea of calling it incest or making that taboo to marry within your own clan is if you're forced to marry into a different clan, you now have formed an alliance. Your group is not likely to go to war against that clan if you've got relatives over there, grandchildren, whatever. So it was kind of interesting. Even today, you go to the American Southwest, the Navajo, the Hopi, the Zuni, even the Mohicans. Mohicans are not too much on that anymore. The Iroquois are like that. Don't marry within your clan. Don't marry within your clan. But migratory fish and tributaries, it had been just an absolutely spectacular way, easy to catch food. When you woke up in the morning, you didn't have to worry about where your next meal was coming from. You knew. All you had to do was go down the road, and you'd have something. In the spring, white suckers on the top, river herring. This spring, in fact, it's probably about to start now. We'll see white suckers, we'll see river herring. Perhaps not in the abundance that was here at one time, but good numbers still nonetheless. We've done a lot to degrade the ecological abundance in the Hudson Valley with dams and a lot of other things, but still, it's still pretty. The American shad. Good evidence that the native people fished for American shad. Striped bass, which are a prize game fish today. Good evidence they were after striped bass as well. Sturgeon. This is the very best evidence for the first people fishing in the Hudson Valley is sturgeon. All those other fish were inferring that they were here. They must have caught them. They must have, you know. But as far as physical evidence, this fish is the one we have physical evidence. In fact, over there you will see these guys have modified scales, 5 rows of called skews. There are these little bumps right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There's 5 rows of these skews. When the fish biodegrades and goes away, these scutes remain behind. They're cartilage. In fact, these are cartilage fish. They're kind of like sharks. They're made of cartilage. The support structure is kind of like the support structure of a shark. So we find those scutes. We've done archaeology at Bowden Park. Over here in town in Poughkeepsie, we have found these. Tivoli Bays, we have found them there, and other places as well. Almost any place you find a Native American site, you're going to find these. And I've got 2 little boxes of them over there. You can look at them, and they date to about 1,400 years ago, something like that. We've excavated those. Okay. So we do find these we call them bony plates, but they're really not. They're really cartilage. And we find assemblages of tools where there's these big stone knives we find along the Hudson River. Because if you're dealing with a sturgeon that's 9 feet long and weighs 500 pounds, you don't take your little filleting knife out and fillet it. You got to hang it by its tail in a tree and deal with it like it's a bear or a deer or a caribou or something like that. You've got to actually butcher it. They're that big. So they have specialized tools for that. And the other evidence of fishing along the Hudson River are these little things called net sinkers. They're little palm-sized rocks of sandstone, sometimes quartzite, and all the native people did was go along, pick up a little stone, hammer a little notch on either side, here, and they could tie these to the bottom of their nets. Their nets were made out of natural cordage, dog bane, flea bane, and they would tie them on the bottom of the net, use gourds as floats, and they could fish their net. And when they're done, they could take off those net sinkers and throw them on the beach and carry their net where they're going to the next time they're going to fish. Why carry rocks? You can make new ones later on. So the beaches of the Hudson River, if you know what to look for, are fairly strewn with these. They're not hard to find. You have to develop a sight image. When you're walking on the beach, you've got to be able to see them. But they're around. By the way, we have another famous archaeologist in the house tonight. You probably didn't know that. Bill Jackson's son, Tommy. Here he is in his workshop. Working very studiously. Can you see this? Yeah, here he is. And this happens to be, I couldn't get the picture to go the right way. This is a net sinker that he, this famous archaeologist, discovered while walking a beach in Beacon. Long Dock has a beach right there. And he's going along picking up nice pieces of limestone. And he picks this one up, net sinker, you know. So, how old are you, Tommy? How old are you? He's 3. So you guys can find one too if you know what they look like. And you know, you can look, there's a whole bunch of them. You kind of get an idea what they look like. They use nets, they use weirs or pound nets to direct fish into enclosures where they could easily get them out. And again, we're inferring a lot of this because the actual devices they used on the Hudson River are no longer around. The tremendous tides and currents that we have, the ice, all those things that have been there for thousands and thousands of years have taken away any evidence of any of these fishing techniques. The net sinkers tell us they were using nets. And the fact that other groups in other parts of the country, the United States, North America, use weirs, they probably did them here too as well. And in the upper Hudson, in the Batten Kill, and in the Snook Kill, two tributaries of the northern Hudson, there is some evidence of this kind of a structure. Up there wasn't a lot of tide, there was no tides at all, so some of the stuff remained. In the summer, they would fish for blue crab, delicious blue crabs. Right? There's a male on the top of Jimmy and a female on the bottom of Sally. They had red tips on their claws. Now these are hunters and gatherers. Every day they woke up, they had a plan where their next meal was coming from. Fruits and berries throughout the area, certainly this part of Dutchess County was probably a very good place to find fruits and berries. In the autumn, they would hunt ducks and geese. They had it figured out. You know, today, all of us, every single one of us, to some degree, has lost touch with the natural cycles of what goes on. You know, most people know, when the mall opens, you know, things like that, important stuff, right? But as far as like sunrise, sunset, the seasons, what's available, what's around, we don't have a need for that anymore. Nobody knows when the tide is high, Poughkeepsie, because we don't have to know that anymore. But these folks were really fine-tuned in everything that went on. They knew all of that stuff. It was institutional knowledge that they knew all of that. That's how they lived. In the winter, they went hunting for white-tailed deer. In sites that I work in the Hudson Valley, in Dutchess County, I worked a lot in Dutchess County, by far the most common animal remains I find are white-tailed deer. They love their white-tailed deer. From a white-tailed deer, they would use the bones and the antlers for tools. The skin would be for clothing. Deer skin and buck skin, they would use that. And they'd eat the fish, or they'd eat the flesh. Nothing went to waste. They really did use every part of every animal as far as we can tell. In the winter, they watch seals and other marine life in the river. We do have seals in the Hudson River. Even now we do. We have harbor seals, hooded seals, gray seals. Let's see, gray, seal, hooded, and harbor seals. 4 kinds of seals. We have harbor porpoises from time to time. We have bottlenose dolphins. On occasion, we'll have a white-sided dolphin. So we have a fair amount of marine mammals in the Hudson River, and there's no evidence that the native people ever went out and got one, but they did in other places, and so it well could be that they did. People were here, and something happened about 9,000 years ago. Before 9,000 years ago, people liked it here, but winters were still, they could be kind of nasty. So there was evidence that people would come here during the warm season and then move maybe down to New Jersey, if you can imagine, in the colder times of the year. About 9,000 years ago, the climate finally got nice enough all the time, maybe warmer than today, so people decided to live here. We sort of categorize, as archaeologists, time periods of the past based upon residence pattern. When they were migrating in and out, that was what we call the Paleo-Indian. When they were here and decided they were going to live here, it's called the Archaic period. The Archaic period is a period that you find throughout the Americas. Other groups use the same thing. And then there'll be a later one on, which is called the Woodland period. And the Woodland period is when people began to settle down a little bit more. But from 9,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago, in Dutchess County, it would have been, in here, it would have been a very busy place. You'd see groups of people, clans, small bands of Indians, native people. They'd be here today and over there tomorrow. They didn't spend very much time in one place because they were following resources, we think. That's what they were doing. You might know that young lady right there. Do you know the young lady there? Where'd she go? That's not here right now. This is Bill Jackson's wife. And that's a younger version, I take it, I think. I know how many years. This happens to be a rock shelter at Bowden Park in the town of Poughkeepsie that one of the places, one of the way stations these hunters and gatherers would use. Maybe a small band would stay at this rock shelter. It's kind of fallen down right now, but they might stay there for a couple of days while they were fishing, and then they'd move on, and another group would move in. It's exactly like if you go hiking in the Adirondacks or the Catskills. You get a map in the forest, there's the lean-tos. Every so often, you walk for 6, 8, 10 hours, here's a lean-to. And then you walk another half a day, here's another lean-to. People who hike in the high peaks of the Adirondacks oftentimes will plan their days around, at the end of the day, they arrive at a lean-to where they can sleep for the night. Kind of like what these were all about. Hunters and gatherers, seasonal residents, they did not exceed carrying capacity. You know, today in the Hudson Valley, you probably would all admit, and I certainly would propose that we have too many people. Tremendous strain on the support systems of the Hudson Valley. The stable population was an interesting way to look at this too. The stable population had more to do with reproduction. The average generation for these people was 25 years. And you might say, gee, that's young. But you had a lot of people who lived to be 50, and then a lot of children died in childbirth. They were very, very young. The average is 25 years, but that's a generation. But the way it worked was, mom and dad would have a baby, and mom would nurse that baby, which is kind of a birth control by itself, and they would not have another child until, now they had no forms of birth control except natural birth control. They would not have another child until that child would be like Tommy. He could walk and do things for, you didn't have to carry him. Right? Then they'd have another baby. By the time that baby came and grew up and was able to fend for himself, they probably were at a point in their life that they didn't want to have any more children. They didn't have any more, or they weren't around anymore. So it's kind of a natural birth control. They pretty much replaced themselves in their lifetimes. Maybe one extra because the population did rise. But it was like natural birth control. Right? It was all based upon, and the reason for that is, and you'll understand what I'm saying, right? The women did all the work. The women did all the heavy lifting. So if you've got a babe in arms, you don't need another one. That babe's got to be able to walk. Because when they travel from place to place, mom carried all their possessions. And something called a travois or something like that, some kind of a sled, some kind of a conveyance where all their possessions would go on it. Mom would carry that because dad was over the hill doing something much more important, leading the way. So, yeah, well, hey, how many women do want to heavy lifting today, right? It happens. And so anyway, so mom was smart. She's not going to have two little babies, because then who's going to, dad's not going to carry that. So it wasn't going to work. About this time, we began to realize, and this is only one example, of evidence that we find that the people living here in Dutchess County had their trade routes going as far, believe it or not, there's one example evidence that their trade routes went as far west as North Dakota. But certainly Michigan was common, the Ohio River Valley, Mississippi River Valley, well into Connecticut and New England, and to the south, and Pennsylvania. A lot of the stone tools we find are made of jasper. And jasper is in Berks and Bucks County, Pennsylvania. The ones on the left there are heat treated. But there's this evidence that piles up of all kinds of artifacts that either came from distant places or they were certainly influenced by distant places. You know, in prehistory, east of the Hudson River was New England. It was not on any political maps, but the native people who lived here considered themselves part of that region. The Hudson River was kind of a dividing line. That side, there were people living over there that were related to them, but you were sort of like New England people. You know, and really today, it is kind of true. You know, east of the Hudson River is really part of New England. What's the difference between here, you know, and Stonington, or, you know, Winston, Connecticut? Not a whole lot. Not a whole lot. We have political boundaries and stuff. But as far as everything else is concerned, you might as well be in Connecticut. And we find a lot of tools that either the materials come from Connecticut or Massachusetts or even Maine, you know, or the styles come from there. So there's a great influence and from far away places. The prehistoric trade routes, you know, we're down in here somewhere, and you know, way out to the western part of New York State, way over to the Midwest, all of New England. Long Island was a big part of the influence, and of course down to the south here too. By about 5,000 years ago, people here suddenly realized there was a bigger world out there, and they began using it. Eastern Woodland period, about 3,000 years ago, some new technologies came along, and that is what gives us different resonance patterns. The people in the entire Hudson Valley, almost everyone, were what we call Algonquian speakers. They spoke a language group of Algonquian. Now, within that language group, there were Lenape and Munsee and a lot of the Mohican and the Wappinger and a lot of different, the Esopus Indians, but they shared a language. They at least shared a language group. Right? So when we start talking about the names of the groups, it's probably better to keep it a language group only because we know that's true. The rest of it we're not too sure about. But certainly, this area here would have been a dividing line between what we call the Wappinger Indians, who knows what they called themselves, and the Mohican, who knows what they called themselves. This was sort of like the southern boundary of the Mohican and the northern boundary of where the Wappinger people were. But some of these new technologies, the first one was ceramics. And I've got some ceramics, these are called potsherds. The first one was ceramics. The idea of creating ceramic pots is something that made native people suddenly say, we can't be moving around as much anymore, because these are very fragile. Right? The technology of ceramics came from the west and southwest. People had ceramics in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, 500 years before they had them here, something like that. And that idea kind of crept east and finally ended up here. This made it possible to be much more efficient in cooking and storing things. The second one was plant domestication, somewhere around 2,000 years ago. We used to think it was 1,000 years ago, but just within the last couple of years we found really good evidence that corn, for example, was being cooked here in the Hudson Valley 2,000 years ago in pots. And it's interesting how we found out about that. And archaeologists, when you do archaeology and you find these pieces of pottery, very quickly you realize that the native people, when they were done cooking, they never cleaned their dishes when they were done. So on the inside of the pots, there was this thick residue. Sometimes it's a ½ inch thick black residue, all the grease and whatever was in the food. Well, this archaeologist at the State Museum said, I wonder if we can use that. It's organic. And they took it, they scraped it off, and they did some analysis of it. And when they did the analysis of that was left over on the inside of a pot, they found out that they had been cooking corn 2,000 years ago. They do what's called an isotope analysis. Each plant type, under certain circumstances in a lab, will give off a different image of an isotope, and that's how they found that they were cooking corn 2,000 years ago. It may turn out we'll find them even further back, but at least now, about 2,000 years ago. Sunflower and tobacco. Tobacco's an interesting one because we've never found any direct evidence of the tobacco plants. But we know tobacco is here, not because we have ever found tobacco, but because we began to find their pipes. Without pipes, what good is a pipe without tobacco? About 2,000 years ago, we begin to find these stone elbow pipes in the Hudson Valley. In Orange County, across from New Hamburg, is a fossil fuel power plant called Dan Scamber Point. It's out of commission now, but when it was built in the early 1950s, there was a very brief bit of archaeology done there. The developer said, yeah, we'll give you 30 days to get what you can get. It probably should have been a 4 or 5 year project. They gave them like 30 days. But they found some of these pipes. That is evidence that they were smoking pipes. Now, indigenous people throughout the Americas smoked ceremonially. Traditionally, your shaman, your holy person, used a pipe and the smoke of the pipe, and the pipe smoke would be a conduit between you and the people and whatever your deity is that you're checking out. So the pipes were very... Now, when Europeans showed up, they thought it was nifty. They began to smoke for other reasons, which is kind of where we are today. Somewhere around 800 AD, 8800, the bow and arrow finally arrived. The bow and arrow was one of these new innovations, new technology we can actually track. Because they appeared out in the Midwest before that, even the Southwest. But you can imagine the Midwest, what a great technological advance this would be. Here you are out in the Midwest where you can see forever, and there's herds of bison out there, and if you try to get close to them, even close enough for an lateral to throw a spear, they're gone. So what you had to do was be able to kill at a distance. The bow and arrow gave them a chance to kill at 100 yards. Long distance. There were so many bison, you didn't even have to aim. You just went, and you'd probably get a bison. There's so many of them. But still, it was a great technological advance that moved its way here. Now, how do we know that? Do we have any bows? No. Do we have anything written down? No. But 8,800 arrowheads begin to show up. Everything before that, any little spear point we would find, if you put it on the head of an arrow, you couldn't shoot it across this room. Much too big, much too heavy. 8,800, we began to find these little triangles. Little triangles. These match up perfectly with the American Southwest, where they actually have had arrows that have survived over time. They got these little triangles. Right? So we're inferring, but we're pretty darn sure that about 8,800, these little triangles begin kind of with a pipe. We knew they were smoking because they had pipes. We knew they had bow and arrow because they had arrowheads. So that was the third innovation. And the interesting thing about this is a little bit of geometry here. These are equilateral triangles, right? Equilateral triangles, for the most part, it's not 100%, but for the most part, was symbolic, emblematic of the Algonquian speakers who lived in the Hudson Valley, right here, right? Lavana Point, Algonquian speakers. To the west of us were the Iroquoian speakers who spoke an entirely different language. Iroquois is an entirely different language. They couldn't understand each other. They were often at odds with the Algonquian people. And their arrowhead was a little different, and it was an isosceles triangle. You know your geometry, that's an isosceles triangle. So most of the time, that holds true pretty good. When we do archaeology in Hudson Valley, particularly near the Hudson River, sites along the Hudson River, we not too infrequently find these points. The story we've concocted that goes along with this, and we think it's true, is that the Iroquois would often raid the Hudson Valley, Algonquian tribes and their villages, and they would cart away women. Now you might say, ooh, that sounds possible, but they carted the women away not for reasons you might think. The women were the potters, the makers of ceramics. A good potter was worth her weight in wampum. Right? So they would take the women away who were the good potters. That's because we have found pottery in the Hudson Valley styles that a year later show up out by the Finger Lakes. It's the same woman, they simply took her over there. So we think these were raiding parties for, among other things, to look for good potters. They would take the women and whisk them away. But this is the Iroquois influence, and we do find some of these. 1,000 years ago, the people began to rely a lot on growing their own food, right, about 1,000 years ago. They developed this idea of the three sisters. When people hear this, they think it's a New Age idea, the three sisters. It's something we made up. The fact of the matter is, this is how indigenous people throughout the Americas, North America, Mesoamerica, South America, this is how they grew these crops, which were common everywhere you went. They would grow the corn in the ground, and the corn would grow, and then the corn would act as a trellis for the beans. They would climb up the beans. And then they would put the squash on the bottom. The squash would cool the soil and keep the weeds away. So the three of them worked together beautiful. Symbiosis. They would work together beautifully. When the Europeans showed up, they saw this, when they got done laughing, cluttered, right? They put all the beans in one field and all the squash in another field and all the corn in another field. And they worked those fields until they were sterile, and then they didn't realize why they weren't getting corn anymore. The idea of crop rotation is something Indians knew. Europeans had to learn it the hard way. Right? Their lifeways were reflected in their tools, a muller, a double-pitted stone. These are the kinds of stone tools. We find these, and it's just the way it is. We have to look at their tools and sort of figure out, what happened here. What were they up to? What were they doing? That's kind of the way archaeology is. When we excavate a site, we may find 10% of all the stuff that was there at one time. And from that 10%, we've got to reconstruct events and times and all sorts of things. And finally, as clans, they began living in villages to protect their crops. They could be these running all over the place, following resources. They would have a village, and they would send a group of people out to go fishing, another group to go hunting, another group to go get berries, whatever it happened to be. Tap some maple trees for maple sap. They would do it, but they would be in a village to protect their crops. They would do that. This was the final innovation they had. Now, I mentioned before that archaeology tends to be very one-dimensional. It's very much black and white. Here's an artifact. I'll tell you what I know about it. What I'd like to try to do is what I call putting a face on people. Simple things like, is there anybody here who has to be left-handed? Come on, you can admit it. Don't be shy. It's okay. In the world today, about 3 in 10 people are left-handed. No, 1 in 10. About 1 in 10 people are left-handed. I have probably curated 35, 40,000 stone tools in my life. And because I'm left-handed, when I pick up a stone tool, I'm very sensitive to whether, when this tool was being used, was it held in the left hand or the right hand. Doesn't mean they were left-handed or right-handed, it just means where they held the tool. When it was a tool that was used for repetitive tasks, it only makes sense that they would shape it, and they did, to fit their hand so that they wouldn't get blisters, it would fit very comfortably. Knives, scrapers, hammer stones were often tailored to how a person would hold them. What I have discovered over time in thousands of artifacts is that it could have been that 1 out of every 3 of these stone tools was held in the left hand, whereas today it would have been 1 out of 10. Does it mean 1 out of 3 native people were left-handed? Maybe, maybe not, probably not. But we do know that when Europeans showed up, being left-handed was not a good thing. Or, according to Europeans, you were the spawn of Satan, all you left-handers. You were the spawn of Satan if you were left-handed. Both my grandfathers were left-handed. They went through elementary school with their left hand tied behind their back. Right? Being left-handed was not good. And with pottery, women made all the pottery. And so we could, right away, we had sort of a feeling about who these people were. Here are right-handed knives. These were held in the right hand. The business edge. Here's the business edge right here. Here's the business edge. These are right-handed knives. A little knife like this called a micro. You could clean a white-tailed deer with that. You could skin a white-tailed deer. They're very, very sharp. And those left-handed among us, here's the business edge on these. business edge on these. Under a microscope, this edge has a lot of burnishing, and you can actually tell by the kind of burnishing as whether or not this was used to cut leather, pelts, fur, skin, or wood. You can tell by the different kinds of burnishing. And there's actually blood residue on some of these. And if I had the money to do the hemoglobin analysis, I could even say what kind of fish or animal was being butchered with it. But that kind of money doesn't exist. But this kind of puts a face on the people. I like to know there's left-handed Indians out there. Kind of a little kinship there, right? Now here's a chert knife that was used by a left-handed person. And when they made this knife, it's kind of hard to see this knife, but here's the business edge right here. When they made this, here's a brachiopod. It's probably 250 million years old. And this brachiopod was left right in the middle of this knife. And you have to wonder, here's where the left thumb would go right here. You have to wonder, when the maker made this, did he look at that and say, wow, nice ornamentation. I'm going to put that right there. Probably. It gives you a feeling about these people a little bit. And then the one I really love, it's hard to make out. This is a fingerprint right here. And if you believe that fingerprints are fairly, universally different among people, there are like no two people in the world probably have the same fingerprints. Here is a piece of pottery we found at Bowden Park in the town of Poughkeepsie, and it has a woman's thumbprint. This is not uncommon. We find fingerprints fairly frequently. But I look at this and I realize, I hold a piece in my hand. This is a particular woman who lived at a particular time, and here's her fingerprint. It's kind of nice. It adds some dimensionality to what is otherwise very single dimension, or one dimension. All right, we're getting near the end. This is, of the work I've done in the Hudson Valley, this is kind of what it looks like in terms of occupancy. It looks like, 9,000 years ago, there were not very many people. We built up to a crescendo somewhere around between 4 and 6, and it dropped off until the Europeans showed up somewhere here in 1609. You can interpret it that way. I interpret this a little bit differently. The way I look at it is, yeah, this was a high point. But this probably continued all the way across. What happened was here is that these deposits are closer to the surface. Those are the deposits that have been destroyed by development. Every time you build a city, you build a mall, a highway, the most recent deposits are gone, and those are the ones that would show up there. It kind of gives you a little idea of people living in Hudson Valley. September 1609, Europeans arrived with a very, very different worldview. And a big thing happened. Humans went from being bystanders, or part of the landscape, or part of the community of life, to being difference makers. Whether it was a purpose or we just did it that way, we don't really know. But they became different, and we continue to be difference makers today. We're trying to soften our footsteps a little bit, but we're still very much difference makers. September 11, 1609, you may know that day, September 11, 2001. Well, coincidentally, Henry Hudson anchored off of the World Trade Center wasn't there, but he anchored off of right here in New York Harbor on September 11, 1609, and in Edward Sewett's journal that day, he was the first mate for Henry Hudson, his final line was, after saying wonderful things about the Indians, he finally said, but we durst not trust them. Right? When I read this and think about it, this was the day that the people of the Hudson Valley lost their sense of innocence. They didn't know, but they did. And lo and behold, September 11, 2001, the people of New York once again lost their sense of innocence. The Algonquian people from here, taught the Dutch and then the English how to farm, fish, and live off the land. And they did that very, very well. They were not warlike. This is important here. Europeans met native people who could trace their ancestry back 500 generations. Since 1609, we've had 14 generations. This is important because in 2009, we had the 4th anniversary of Henry Hudson sailing up the river. And I worked for the New York State DEC. And you would have thought that, there was a second coming of Christ with Henry Hudson, right? Who, if you know Henry Hudson, you know he wasn't a very nice guy. He ended his days being put into a longboat with his sons and set adrift in Hudson Bay because his crew couldn't take him anymore. He was really not a very nice guy. But during the celebration of the 4th anniversary of Henry Hudson, we heard all kinds of things, accolades every day about Henry Hudson this, Henry Hudson that. You would think when he came here it was a barren landscape. I heard some really disturbing things. The most disturbing one I heard was an ad on National Public Radio of all places where a woman said, and she wasn't National Radio, she was somebody talking on the radio station, that Henry Hudson brought God into the Hudson Valley. If I was a native person, I'd be very upset about a statement like that. That is very ridiculous. Right? But 500 generations, so there's a lot of legacy with prehistory in the Hudson Valley. The native people try to teach them respect for the land. This guy here, right? But the river after Henry, a lot of things changed. The tributaries were dammed, the forests were clear-cut, species were extirpated, fisheries threatened, and the Indians were displaced. When I do this program for fourth graders, at the end, they raise their hand, they say, where are all the Indians today? They're either dead or they're living in faraway places. The Mohican people, for example, are living out in Wisconsin on a piece of land that nobody else wants to live on. The people to the south of us, the Lenape, are living in Oklahoma on a piece of land nobody else wants to live on. So there was actual genocide going on in North America against indigenous people for a long, long time. And that's why we're where we are today. Europe brought their continental wars to North America. The Indians, the Algonquian people, for example, they pretty much, the Iroquois had this real problem. They kept picking the wrong side. During the French and Indian War, they went with the French. They lost. During the American Revolution, they sided with the British. They lost. The Algonquian people were a little more fortunate, people living around here. They seemed to pick the right sides, so they worked out better. But smallpox eradicated many of them. A lot of native people living in Dutchess County, the Wappinger people, went off to war to fight the British. They came back and found out that their land had been taken over by other people. They had no more land rights. So they were said, we can move along now. Many of them moved to Massachusetts, and they went to Pennsylvania, and they went to Ohio, and they finally ended up out in Wisconsin. How do we know all this stuff? Again, it's archaeology. It's archaeology. It's one of the lures of archaeology that when you dig in the ground, when you dig down, you dig 3 feet down in the ground, and you step in that hole, and you're stamping on the living floor that extinct elephants used to run on. Right? And, right outside here, we dig down, 6 inches, and that's Henry Hudson's. That's the living floor that Henry Hudson could have been standing on. And it's that kind of an idea. It's like you're opening a book of the past as you go. It's that kind of thing that really. It's a very, very powerful feeling we have. We stand on the living floors of past cultures, and the important thing is we are privy to changes that have occurred. But archaeologists discovered an incomplete record of the past for reasons that I mentioned, all the development. And one of the things that's most disturbing as an archaeologist is to witness the erasure of native cultures from the landscape. That's one of the disturbing things. When we go back to a depth in the ground that says 1600, and we look at what we find above that, it's like a blank slate. The Indians are not farming anymore, they're not trading anymore, they're simply trying to adapt to a Western worldview, a Western lifestyle, and they aren't able to do it. They aren't able to do it. So the cultures of the indigenous people just simply get erased. So these fourth graders, when I tell them that, they cry. If we were in Arizona, New Mexico, I could tell you that, in fact, the fourth graders I'd be talking to would be by and large, be either part Indian or all Indian. The Indians are still there in the American Southwest, but not here. So the question is, where were they? Well, they were here. The people of Millbrook were here. They're just not here anymore. Right? They just are, yeah, you know that picture? The little postcard? Yeah, they're just not here anymore. Today we only have a very fragmented idea of the people and what they were all about and what their culture was all about. Both Millbrook here and Millbrook. Thank you very much. There's Q&A. Yeah. Now we can either do that sitting down, or you can have snacks.
Now let's do
Let's do some Q&A, and then we'll have an opportunity to look at the stuff over there. Yes, question over here.
What have you learned about the burial practices of these various native societies?
If you go, what's the question? The question is about burial practices. I mentioned before that if you go back past about even 1,500 years ago, we don't know because the bones have dissolved into the soil. But the oldest burials that we find, and we have found some, particularly across the river where there's a lot of limestone deposits which sweetens the soil so they don't dissolve so fast. These are flexed burials, head, feet to the east, head to the west, and you can see the sun rising. Sometimes flexed burials where they'll be, their legs are drawn up. But burials, not a whole lot in the way of cremation as far as we can tell. What goes on back, say 2,000 years ago and beyond, we really just don't know. But the burials, and we don't find that many burials. The soil in the Hudson Valley is not kind to bones. It isn't. And there are some burial areas, graveyards, that are of the AD 1415, 1600, and I know of several that bulldozers have destroyed when they're building a parking lot or something. So it's what happens in areas that is this popular. Is that a question? Hope that's a good answer for you. Questions? Oh, come on.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
Tom, can we reintroduce the condor to the area?
Well, yeah, you could. The Condors are
Stewart
doing
Airport
well in the
probably
Midwest
love
right
that,
now.
huh?
This summer, some of us are going to the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and we'll see the California Condors flying around. Fairly good number of them. And it's interesting because they travel from Montana to the Grand Canyon in like 3 or 4 days, back and forth. And yeah, they could be here. The problem is you'd be reintroducing them to an environment that's not anything like what they're used to. I mean, I can see a condor coming down on Route 9 to get, you know, a roadkill, and next thing you know, a truck runs it over. I mean, I can see that. They're used to places where there's not that many people around. Their native range would not be a place like where we are. You can do it, but...
Future project, maybe.
Yeah, well, what may happen over time, it's not impossible that over time, they may come back on their own. If there's enough of them, they may come back on their own. And if they do it, then it's going to be okay. You have a question? You, yeah, go ahead.
I understand the narrative of Washington Hollow, so that the Hollywood Cave is an important gathering place for Wappinger Indians.
Yeah, that's near Wappinger Creek, right?
What the Wappinger Creek
Yeah.
goes through, it
Yeah.
backs up to the
Yeah.
Caribbean Super.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any
Yeah.
archaeological surveys that have
Oh,
done
well,
this?
that I'd have to look into. I've never done any work there myself, but I can tell you that Wappinger Creek, all the way from New Hamburg, all the way up to its headwaters, is just like one continuous prehistoric occupation. And people have had, a lot of people have their houses right along the creek. When they built those houses, they had to destroy very important stuff. The place you're naming, the geography of that site would be a place where people would normally get, I know the place. So yes, you're right. And what you'd have to do, you'd have to go to the New York State Parks Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation on People's Island, and ask Doug Mack, who works there, could I have an idea if anybody's ever done any archaeology? And they probably let you do it. Look up. You have to look through boxes and boxes of site reports and stuff. Yes.
Have there been many archaeological digs inland, really, or maybe away from the Wappingers, where they look for the wampum, or not the wampum, the wigwam? Was it? It wasn't the longhouse. It was
They used,
something else.
yeah.
With wood still in the ground, or just
Yeah.
discoloration of the soil.
The question is, how do we know what they were living in? At Bowden Park, for example, we excavated there. We did not find, they had wigwams, they had huts they used for smoking. The huts are gone, but there are stains in the soil where the supports were right in the ground. They've dissolved, but the wood, when it dissolved, left circular stains. That's how we find it. There was one example of the Algonquian, the Mohican people, using a longhouse, or a couple longhouses, up in Columbia County, called the Goldcrest site. But the longhouse was by and large an Iroquoian phenomenon. The people here probably used what we call wigwams. And a lot of the stuff that we know is what we call ethnographic. Being historians, you know what the word ethnography is. When the first Europeans showed up, they interviewed a lot of the elders, and they asked them to tell us all you know about your people. Native people had no written language. Theirs was an oral tradition. They told stories. So it was okay. But how much time depth they had to their stories is anybody's guess. But at the time the Europeans came, they were living in wigwams, and the elders said, we've lived in these as far back as we know. There's some interesting points to make, though. For example, the Mohican people, they're friends of mine. And when I talk to them, they firmly believe they have only been in the Hudson Valley for 1,000 years. They like archaeology, but they like their own oral tradition better. They think they've only been here for 1,000 years. As an archaeologist, when I excavate a Mohican site and I look at the ceramics are almost like fingerprints. I see a continuation of the same ceramics that were here 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. So it looks to us like the ancestral Mohican people were here for thousands of years. They'll argue and you say, no. We came far from the West 1,000 years ago. That's their origin myth. All native people have an origin myth. So what we try to do is combine hard science with their origin myths to try to find out the middle ground. You have to do that. Otherwise they won't talk to you. Yes?
The Mastodon in Hyde Park, you mentioned.
Yes.
Where was it founded? How was it
It was off 9, Haviland Road. Yeah, which is what, that's 9 what? Haviland Road, yeah, but that's not 9, it's 9. 9G. Off 9G, Haviland Road, yeah. Yeah, it was, what happened was, the guy was having his backyard To start at the very beginning, I'll make it quick. He had a big pond the size of a hockey rink, and every winter when it froze over, there'd be a lot of ice. In the spring, all the fish would be dead. He went to the Cornell Co-op and said, "What's going on here?" And they said, "Your pond's too shallow. The fish are dying. There's no oxygen." So he had a guy come in with a backhoe, actually an excavator, and dig 4 holes in the 4 corners of the pond, deep holes. The fish could go there. That was fine. While he was digging these holes, he found some bones. He did not want to let anybody know he found bones, so he tried to bury them all. He'd had a bad experience previously when he had a job. I think it was a Walmart in Kingston. He was building, and up in his shovel came bones, and they turned out to be human bones. And he didn't get paid for like over a year. The state police came in and all. So he said, if bones ever come up in my scoop again, I'm not going to tell anybody. Of course, the bones he picked up was a humerus that was this big from an extinct elephant.
Yeah.
So, you know, anyway, so they called Dutchess Community College and they said, get somebody up here who knows something about something. Well, I was there were not many people in the office that day. And so I said, you. So I went up and I looked at the bones and said, this is a big elephant here. Probably a big elephant. And it's interesting because we could not assume it was an extinct form of elephant because, you know, knowing Hyde Park, you know, 100 years ago, the circus might have come to town, the Roosevelts, the Vanderbilts, and a circus elephant might have gotten loose, run amok, dove in the pond, and died. It could be a circus elephant, but we found out no missing circus elephants. So, but that was the story of that. And we finally got it. 13 months it took to get that out of the ground, radiocarbon dated. An exact replica of it is at the Children's Museum in Poughkeepsie. The original is put together and it's out at the Museum of the Earth out in Ithaca.
If we had some amateur or budding amateur archaeologists in this audience tonight, what words of wisdom or recommendation would you give them, or would you direct them?
Well, the first thing you want to do, if ever you start doing anything like that, most of it's against the law probably, because you have to either have some sort of a permit. But the thing that makes a difference in doing that kind of work between what the amateur might do and somebody who has an idea what they're doing is document everything you do, everything you find. Take photographs. Because down the road, somebody may look and say, you know, you found something very important. Where did you find it? What day? How deep in the ground? Geez, I don't know. So documenting what you do, even on a small scale, is very important. Photos and documentation. If you happen to dig, like in your backyard, if you're digging, you know, measure where you find something. All those kinds of things are very important. As far as finding a place, you know, I'm not sure what to say about that. Most of the archaeology we do today, we used to do archaeology in this country for knowledge, the love of knowledge. We don't do that anymore because there's no money. The only way we do archaeology anymore, we do education at Dutchess Community College. But other than that, most of the archaeology is done when somebody wants to build a housing project or a new store or something like that. You know? Or what we're seeing a lot now is family farms. Mom and dad have had the family farm forever from their parents and their parents, but now their kids have grown up and they want to go to the big city. They don't want to do the farm anymore. So mom and dad can't run the farm no more, so they have to sell it to a developer who's going to make a bunch of houses. Before the developer can do that, we have to go in and make sure that the developer is not going to destroy the next Jamestown, you know, something like that. And whenever we do this, we hope we'll find something so fantastic that they can't sell it. Then the state will come in and buy it and make it a national park or something. It doesn't happen very often. So a lot of family farms are being lost now because they just can't keep them up anymore. So we're seeing bedroom communities all over the place. But to answer your question, document everything you do, take really good notes, and yeah, other than that, as far as finding a place to go, that'd be up to your individual taste. Because historic archaeology is important too. You probably have a better luck, you know, looking at, you know, around an historic building to see what might be the builder's trenches around a historic building or something like that. But documentation and photographs is labeling, all that kind of stuff is so important. So important. Yeah.
You said there were the Indians around here, but I thought there were Indians who work on the skyscrapers in New York City.
Those weren't from around here. They were Seneca, they were Mohawk Indians, those were Iroquoian, almost all. There may have been some, the high steel workers that worked on the New York City high steel buildings, those were almost entirely Iroquoian. Not because they had more courage, they were here. Our Indians were out in Wisconsin. You're not going to hire somebody from Wisconsin to work in New York City. They would go up to the reservations here in New York State and get the Indians to do it. So, yeah.
so there are some living.
Yeah. Oh, the Iroquois Indians they were not touched so much. There still are reservations, and the Onondaga, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Oneida, and so on. They're up there, the Mohawk. They're up there, not in quite the numbers they used to be, but they've got their reservations. But the Algonquin people who lived here, they're not here anymore. They're scattered elsewhere. They're just gone. It's a sad story.
Just sort of a comment on that. A few years ago, we had a speaker come to talk about Algonquin in the area, and as we were promoting that program, what I found and heard a lot were people saying, "Oh gosh, my great grandmother was, part Wappinger or Lenape or something," and through that, I think I felt that there's a lot more here than we realize, than we open our eyes to. There's a lot more genetics among us than we may even realize. And it seems, as I think back to it, I sort of picture that people over time just sort of dissipated into the hills or intermarried.
People who don't have a clear image of their genealogy might be surprised if you go back far enough, you may find that you have natives, because there was a lot of intermarrying. But by the 1800s, there were no native people here to speak of. They were all gone, pretty much.
No culture.
Well, one of the standing orders of the United States government was that land in North America was too important to have Indians living on it. That's why they sent them someplace. They made many mistakes. The biggest mistake they ever made was sending the Jicarilla Apache, to a place in southern New Mexico that was godforsaken. I mean, it was nothing good. And these were hunters and gatherers still, and they were making farmers out of them. Well, the Apaches went in and did wonderful things. They were growing crops. They were doing wonderful. The Indian Affairs, the government Indian Affairs went in and saw it and said, "Whoa, what a mistake." They moved them out of there immediately, because that meant that land was too good for Indians, and they moved white people. So they had made mistakes. But that's the story, that's the saga of what happened to Native people. It's not a good story. Any questions? Yes? Hey.
After the glaciers retreated, do we assume that the Native Americans migrated from the south and west toward New England? My question is the Hidden River Valley or the Glacier Lake, do you see any evidence that made a time differentiation between the history?
Yeah, well, it appears that when the glacier left and these tremendous glacial lakes went out, that we had in the Hudson Highlands and down near the Palisades what was almost like a mini Grand Canyon. When you go to the Hudson River today, you look across and here's the land, here's the water. What you don't know is in many cases there's hundreds and hundreds of feet of sediment that was not there. And it was like a mini Grand Canyon in many places in the Hudson Valley. Really, really a lot. Now, as far as with the first people coming here, you would think they would come from the south or the north, except there's all kinds of evidence that as the glacier wasted away, they came from directly west, from western Ontario. They came right along the edge of the glacier. The reason for that is that when you're dealing with a glacier, the warmest place to be is right up next to the glacier. If you're back even 50 miles south of a glacier, the winds coming off of the glacier will just freeze you. You can't survive. The warmest place is in the lee of that glacier, right up next to it. For example, that projectile point you'll see over there called a Barnes Point. It's about 12,500 years old. Those people came from the upper Midwest right across the edge of the glacier. A lot of evidence the very first people came from western Ontario, right along the edge of the glacier. Originally they may have been out in Nebraska, or they may have been out somewhere in Colorado, but when they came here, we think they came from across the edge of the glacier.
But did our valley or our river cause a hiatus in migration?
Well, they would have followed the Mohawk River Valley, and they probably would have found a way across. Yeah, there's some people who believe that the Hudson Valley had created a barrier they couldn't get across. They would have found a way. They would have found a way.
Well, thank you,
Is that all
Tom
that
Lake,
you
for
can
being
take?
with us.
Okay.